On September 11th, what happened was we were in um, the office, and David Frank and I were in my office. We had some early arrivals who were in eating breakfast. We got breakfast for the first group who would be coming in. And David and I were there when suddenly we heard kind of a muffled explosion. The building kind of shook, and then literally it began tipping as I'm tipping my hand now toward the camera. Tall buildings like that are made to be flexible. They're made to tip um, in windstorms and so on. And even if an airplane hits the building, what no one ever expected was that an airplane would be deliberately crashed into a building and that the airplane would hold 26,000 pounds of jet fuel, that it would be fully loaded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Purple Stars podcast. My name is Sarah, and today's guest is a renowned speaker, best-selling author, a miraculous 9/11 survivor, and one of the most resilient and most inspiring people you will ever meet. Please welcome Michael Hingson.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Michael, before we get started, I want to tell you how I discovered you. I went to ChatGPT and I said, please tell me a person that has a hero story, has a connection with animals, and is also willing to share his or her story on our podcast and speaks English. And you were the very first person to come up. And I have not heard about your story before. And when I read that, I was like, this is impossible. Like, did ChatGPT make this up? And then I Googled and immediately I found out, obviously, it's the truth. And I told my entire team, we need to have Mr. Hingson on our podcast, whatever it's going to take. So when you replied that you are happy to come on our show, I was over the moon.
Well, it's nice to know that Chat GPT does like me a little bit. That's a good thing.
Michael, could you please tell us a little bit about your journey and what has made you to the person you are today?
Oh, gosh. What has made me to the person who I am today? I've always wondered that. I am blind. I've been blind my entire life. I was born 2 months premature and put in an incubator with a pure oxygen environment. And that, which is today known as retinopathy o prematurity, when I was born, it was called retrolenteral fibroplasia, which I like better than retinopathy o prematurity. But spelling either one of them can be a challenge. Anyway, what it basically is that a pure oxygen environment can cause the retina and the eye to not properly develop, and it can cause blindness. And back in 1950, when I was born, the reality is that medical science hadn't yet accepted that even too much oxygen can be not a good thing. So they didn't buy into the fact that it could cause blindness, even though some doctors, like Dr. Arnold Patz at the Wilmer Eye Institute at Johns Hopkins University, had begun to discover that even providing a short period of not a pure oxygen environment could help keep blindness from occurring. But anyway, eventually it was discovered. And so now it's a much more informed choice if there is a premature baby and they need to put the child in an incubator, and they have ways to deal with it. But I became blind. And the first thing that the doctors told my parents when it was discovered that I was blind, and that didn't happen until after I was 4 months old, the doctors told my parents, you should send him off to a home for handicapped kids because no blind child could ever grow up to amount to anything and be a productive part of society. And my parents said that's just not true. We're going to raise him to do whatever he chooses. He can certainly be productive. We don't care if he's blind. And the doctor said, but he's going to take all the love that you have and it's going to mess up your older boy who can see. And my parents said, no, it won't. Well, they took me home and I was raised with that attitude that blindness wasn't the problem and that I could choose to do whatever I want. Well, I went to regular schools. I was born in Chicago. We moved to California when I was 5. I went through elementary school and high school in California. And I grew up in a town called Palmdale, which is about 65 miles northeast of Los Angeles. I was very interested in science. My father was an electronics and electrical engineer and worked as a contractor for the military. And anyway, I was always interested in science, got a radio kit and things like that, and then later got my amateur radio, my ham radio license. And my dad got his at the same time that I got mine. He waited because he knew I was interested, so he wanted to give us something to share, which is why we got our licenses at the same time. I also joined the Boy Scouts. I became an Eagle Scout with two extra palms in the Boy Scouts of America, and also was in the Order of the Arrow, which is an honor society within Boy Scouts, and became Vigil, which is the highest rank attainable in Order of the Arrow. And because I had an interest in science, when we started looking at colleges, I discovered this college, University of California at Irvine, which is about 100 miles south of where I grew up. And by the way, I got a guide dog before we went. I went into high school, my first guide dog, because we decided that would probably be a very helpful thing for me to have. And we had met someone who was using a guide dog, and she helped us get me into the school with a reference. And so at the age of 14, I got my first guide dog, Squire, who was a golden retriever. Anyway, we discovered University of California at Irvine, and between my junior and senior years in high school, we went down to meet Dr. Ford, who was the chair of the physics department, and see if it would be a good fit. And after talking to me for an hour, and we talked a little bit of technology and science and things like that, and how I did things, he said, I think you'd be a good addition. You should apply. I did. I was accepted. And in 1968, I went to University of California, Irvine as a freshman. That was the first year UC Irvine also had its first graduating class because it was a brand new college. It was only 4 years old.
Wow.
And and so it was great. I really enjoyed being in a college where there weren't as many students. There were only about 2,700 students, even though it was a huge campus geographically. Um, and they were always building um, new buildings. It's really funny. The people today at UC Irvine say that UCI stands for under construction indefinitely. They're still build, they're still building new buildings, and now there are 32,000 undergraduates. But anyway, when I went there, it was a small campus population wise. Majored in physics, and stayed there through getting my graduate studies and got a master's degree in physics. And I also went to the teacher college there and got a secondary teaching credential. I worked at the campus radio station and so participated in some of the activities of the college. And then in 1976, I had been offered a position by the National Federation of the Blind, which is the largest consumer organization of blind people in the country. And that offer came in 1975. The Federation had met a guy named Ray Kurzweil. You may have heard of him. He's invented this concept of the singularity when computers and people will join together. But back in the mid 1970s, Ray had developed a piece of technology that would literally be able to look at a printed page or a typed page or a combination of the two on the same page. It didn't care what type styles you were using, and it would read that page out loud, or it would recognize the characters. It's a process called omnifont optical character recognition. And Ray was looking for funding to be able to perfect the final version of the machine. And what he wanted the first job of that machine to be was to read print out loud for blind people. But
Wow.
nobody believed that Ray could do it. And so he wasn't successful at getting funding. He eventually went to the Federation, and the Federation, he was so adamant about what his machine could do, they sent a representative to his lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my gosh, the machine read all the stuff that they brought because they said, we don't care what you put on the machine. It's got to read what we bring or we're not interested. And Ray said, bring it on. Anyway, so it did, and a relationship was developed. And the plan was to purchase, well, to raise funds from foundations and to purchase several of the machines and put them around the country for blind people to use to make recommendations to what would be the final first production model of the machine. And I was asked when I was going, well, when it was known I was going to graduate, they figured that'd be about the time the project began. I was asked if I would be interested in taking on the job of kind of doing the day to day operations coordination of the project, literally going to where the machines were, observing people, teaching them how to use the machine, teaching teachers how to use the machine so they could teach others, writing training curricula and so on, and then doing the final job of writing our final report of what needed to go into the production model of the machine. And I accepted. And so in October of 1976, I traveled to Cambridge, well, to Boston, and set up in an apartment, temporary housing, and started working with Ray. And then in 1977, we started putting machines around the country. And literally, I lived in hotels out of suitcases for 18 months during this project. And then I was hired by Ray to continue to do human factor studies inside his company when the project ended, because it was only an 18-month project and that was all it was intended to be. But after about 8 months of being in the company, I was called into the office of the vice president of marketing, and he said, "We have to lay you off." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Oh, it's not that you're doing a bad job. We love the work you're doing, but we haven't hired enough revenue producers. And like a lot of startup companies, we have to hire revenue producers. And so we have to lay off some people who aren't generating funds for us in order to bring on more people who can sell the products that we have." Because they also had now developed in 1979 a new product, which was called the Kurzweil data entry machine, which was a commercial version of the reading machine. And it was intended for banks, lawyers, publishers, and anybody else who needed to scan print and digitize it to be able to scan that print and do things with it. So, um, so the VP of marketing said, "So we have to lay you off." And then he paused and he said, "Unless you're willing to go into sales, and we don't want you, and we don't want you to sell the reading machine for the blind. We want you to sell the Kurzweil data entry machine, the more sophisticated and higher end machine, which is a $125,000 product." And I realized that was a compliment. Um, and as I love to tell people, it took a nano microsecond for me to decide I'll lower my standards and go from science to sales. And so I began selling the Kurzweil data entry machine. I took a Dale Carnegie sales course, a 10-week course, learned about selling, learned the reality of selling and what was right about selling and how to sell appropriately, and then started selling the Kurzweil data entry machine. So that's kind of the story of how I ended up then being in sales. I worked for Kurzweil until 1984, and Xerox bought the company and phased out all of us who were in sales. And I couldn't find a job because the unemployment rate among employable blind people back in those days was like 70%. And it's dropped some since, but not a huge amount. And it's not that blind people can't work, it's that people think that blind people can't work. And so the
Mm.
result is that their prejudice takes over and they won't even consider the reality that eyesight isn't the only way to do stuff and eyesight isn't the only game in town. Well, anyway, so I ended up having to start my own company selling computer aided design systems to architects. So, one of the most graphically intense things that you could possibly imagine. And I started a company with someone else to sell CAD systems, PC based CAD systems to architects, and did that. Um, and the reality is, I didn't need to work the product, even though I couldn't see it. I didn't need to work it. But what I did need to know was how to work it so I could talk intelligently about it and help people understand it. And that was easy to learn. So I did that for 4 years and then sold the company and then went back into the workforce and found a job, um, and began working for another company and did that until 1997. But in 1996, the company I was working for, and I was working in California, that company decided because I was selling to the East Coast that they wanted me to move to the East Coast and sell for them. I was a little bit concerned about how well they would support, because they were a little sort of myopic about how to do that. But I moved to New Jersey. By that time, I was married. I married my wife, Karen, in 1982. And Karen lived her whole life in a wheelchair. And so, as I love to tell people, it was a great marriage. She read, I pushed, worked out well. And so we moved to New Jersey, and I worked in New York, and then eventually was recruited away. And in 1999, I was hired by a company whose products we were kind of reselling. The company I was working for was reselling, and I was hired to open an office for them in New York. And after doing some searching, looking at options, opened the office on the 78th floor of Tower One of the World Trade Center. And we opened the office officially on August 1st of 2000. And on September 11th, 2001, we were going to be teaching some of our reseller partners how to sell our products. A colleague of mine, David Frank, who worked for the same company, and I'd worked with David at another company, so we knew each other. David was at our corporate office in California, and um, when we set up this program to teach our resellers, he decided he would come back because he could talk about pricing and answer economic questions like that. Being technical, I was the technical contact and would be the main person that our resellers would be dealing with going forward. And so I would do the slideshows and so on because the blind person can do PowerPoint shows just like a sighted person. I use a device, well, I use technology called a screen reader. It's a piece of software that verbalizes whatever text comes across the screen. And so doing a PowerPoint show was easy. Anyway, so I would be doing that, and then David would talk about pricing, and we would go from there. But of course, at 8:45 in the morning, suddenly the building sort of shuddered and shook and began to tip. Um, and we didn't know why. People say to me all the time, well, of course, you didn't know, you couldn't see it. The usual, you think that blind people don't know what's going on. The reality is, nobody knew what was going on. I was 18 floors below where the plane hit on the other side of the building. And the last time I checked, I still check every so often, but the last time I checked, Superman and X ray vision are fictitious. The reality is, nobody knew. I'm going down
Mm,
the stairs with hundreds of other people. No one knew. I figured out as we were going down the stairs, I was smelling an odor, and I figured out I'm smelling the fumes from burning jet fuel, and I observed it to other people, and we decided an airplane must have hit the building, but we didn't know what the details were or anything like that. And in fact, I never found out for sure what happened until we were out. Both buildings had collapsed, and I was able to reach my wife. I had called her before we evacuated, but the media hadn't even got the story yet at that point. And anyway, so I was out, the buildings had collapsed, and when I finally reached back out and got a hold of Karen, she's the first one who told us how two aircraft had been crashed into the towers, one into the Pentagon, and a fourth was still missing over Pennsylvania, which is the one that crashed in Shanksville, where Todd Beamer famously said, "Let's roll," when they decided they would go retake the plane. So um, after that, people started, well, the media got my story, and then people started calling and saying, "Gee, would you tell us what we should learn from September 11th?" And I decided, in talking with Karen, because we were getting so many requests to speak, speaking and selling life and philosophy was a whole lot more satisfying and rewarding than managing a computer hardware sales team and selling hardware. So we shifted, or what people would say today, we pivoted, and I decided to start speaking full time. So since actually very late in September, well, actually, early in October was the first time I was paid in a way to speak of 2001. I began speaking. So it's been now over 23 years, and I've been a keynote speaker ever since, traveling and telling the story, talking about trust and teamwork and leadership, lessons we
mm,
should learn from the World Trade Center, talking about inclusion and a variety of subjects. It's sort of funny, people who I reach out to exploring speaking opportunities say, well, we'll see if you fit with our theme. The reality is, my World Trade Center story is what people would call an evergreen story. It's going to be something that will resonate with most people. But because of all of my experiences, I can surround that with other discussions that will fit most anything. I mean, I can spend time talking about AI, including how
Mhm.
accessible or inaccessible it is. I can talk about teaching, having a teaching credential, talk about inclusion, and how when diversity people start to talk about diversity, they'll talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, so on, but they never talk about disabilities because they're just as afraid as anyone else is, and they haven't learned that diversity doesn't really count anymore. They have warped it so much that either you're going to be inclusive or you're not. And you can't
Mhm.
be inclusive unless you're talking also about disabilities. So the reality is I can speak across a wide variety of platforms. Last year, I went to speak at a conference in Texas that was dealing with private agencies in the healthcare industry, teaching specifically, or not teaching, but serving developmentally disabled seniors and so on. And when we were talking about what I should talk about during my speech, I happened to mention that with the National Federation of the Blind, and I've been a member since 1972, we worked to get the insurance industry to start insuring blind people and people with other disabilities because up until the mid 1980s, if you had a disability, insurance companies wouldn't insure you because they said you were a higher risk. But what we discovered along the way was they were violating their own precepts in the insurance industry because they were saying that we were a higher risk, but they had absolutely not one single solitary shred of evidence
Mhm.
to demonstrate that we were truly a higher risk and had a higher mortality rate. And when that was discovered, we began to work with every state legislature to change the laws. And in fact,
Wow.
I coordinated those efforts at the time I was living in Massachusetts working with Kurzweil. And I mentioned that to these people, and they said, we are having some problems. This was an organization in Texas. We're having some problems getting the funding that we need. It would be great if you could talk about that story of getting the insurance industry involved to do the right thing, because we need to motivate our people to talk about and go to their legislators and demand the funding that we want to have. Well, um, so I did include that in my talk, which was certainly different than what a lot of people might be able to do, but I had the experience to do it. And the next thing that was to happen after my talk was that there were two workshops scheduled. One on legislation, which the president of the organization told me usually wasn't well attended at all, just because people were afraid of dealing with that. They didn't want to go see their legislators or they were uncomfortable with it. And then there was another workshop. But after my talk, the director, the president, came out about a half hour after the second session started. And he said, the legislative seminar is standing room only. This is the first time we have had so
Wow.
many people. So as I said, I can deal with a lot of different things.
Mm.
So when people talk about, well, will you fit our theme? The fact is, I can,
Yeah.
in so
Even
many ways.
ChatGPT says that.
Well, there you are. Um, but
um,
that's my story. I know I've talked for quite a
wow.
while, but you asked, so now you
Well,
got the story.
you have a lot to share and a lot that you changed have changed in the world. And could you take us once more back to 9/11? Because I know, like, including me, but also our audience, we're really curious. Like, how was it, like, getting from the 78th floor, as far as I remember, down with your guide dog, Roselle, back then, who kind of also saved your life, right?
We saved each other's lives, and I don't want
Mhm.
to negate what a guide dog does, but let me explain what a guide dog does and what a guide dog doesn't do. Guide
Mhm.
dogs don't lead blind people. Again, it's the usual thing. It goes back to what the doctors told my parents: blind people can't ever amount to anything in society. That is so horribly wrong. Um, and there are contributing factors to that, by the way. We're usually called blind or visually impaired, and visually impaired is the most disgusting, worst thing that you can use to describe blind or people who have lost some of their eyesight. Visually impaired is horrible. Visually, we're not different simply because we're blind, and
Mm.
that's a problem. But impaired is worse. We're not impaired because we're blind. The reality is we may do things differently, but we're not visually. different necessarily, well, because we're blind and we're not impaired, but the professionals in the field created that, and unfortunately, it's stuck. I would prefer that blindness really defines anyone who has lost enough eyesight that they have to use alternatives just to total eyesight in order to function. But society is not ready to do that yet. So blind and low vision is much more accurate, and it takes away this comparison of impaired and how much
Mm-hmm.
eyesight you have or don't have.
Thanks
Um,
for sharing this.
it's like people who are deaf or hard of hearing. If you tell a deaf person that they're hearing impaired, they're liable to impair your life totally forever. The reality is they recognized a long time ago impaired is horrible, and blind people need to do the same thing. It's a process, but
Mm.
um, anyway, so people think that the guide dog does everything. Well, the guide dog doesn't do everything. The job of a guide dog is to make sure that I walk safely, to make sure that if we're coming up to stairs or a curb or objects, the dog will go around them or stop because it can't go around them. Curbs and stairs to stop so I can stick out a foot and see where we are and then give the dog a command. My job is to be the team leader, to tell the dog step
Mm.
by step along the way what I want the dog to do, like go forward, go left. And so I need to be aware of my surroundings. I need to know how to do all of that. And that's what I do. So we work as a team. And the important fact to recognize is that we work best as a team when we each respect the other's job and we both do our jobs together. But my job is also to do a lot of praising of the dog to make sure that the dog understands I'm really pleased with what the dog is doing and encourage the dog to continue to do what I expect the dog to do. Dogs love to know the rules that they're supposed to live
Hmm.
by. They love to know the rules. And so many people say, oh, my dog could never do that. It jumps up and this and that and the other stuff. And the reality is that's because you're not really doing what you could to get your dog to listen to you, to understand what you expect, and to do that in a positive way. And there are ways to deal with that in terms of training the dog and so on. But the fact of the matter is that dogs want to know the rules. They want you to tell them. They want you to be the team leader and to work with them. When it's done right, it works really well. And so on September 11th, what happened was we were in um, the office, and David Frank and I were in my office. We had some early arrivals who were in eating breakfast. We got breakfast for the first group who were be coming in. And David and I were there when suddenly we heard kind of a muffled explosion. The building kind of shook. And then literally it began tipping as I'm tipping my hand now toward the camera. Tall buildings like that are made to be flexible, they're made to tip um, in windstorms and so on. And even if an airplane hits the building, what no one ever expected was that an airplane would be deliberately crashed into a building and that the airplane would hold 26,000 pounds of jet fuel, that it would be fully loaded, and it was intended to be a bomb rather than just an accidental hitting of the airplane into a building. That happened in the 1940s on a military aircraft in a fog bank crashed into the Empire State Building. And it was an accident, but that didn't collapse the building because it wasn't full of fuel. It wasn't deliberately done. But anyway, when the building was struck, the building began to tip. We had no idea what happened because, as I said earlier, it hit 18 floors above us on the other side of the building. And eventually, David and I said goodbye to each other because we thought we were about to take a 78 floor plunge to the street. Then the building stopped and it came vertical again. And when it became vertical, I had, by the way, gone to my office door and was standing in the doorway because I grew up in Palmdale, California. We were right on the San Andreas Fault. And I learned early on building moves, go to door, um, because we had a lot of earthquakes in California. But this wasn't an earthquake because it wasn't shaking around. It was going in one direction, but we had no idea what had happened. Anyway, I was standing in the doorway when the building got vertical again. I went back in and I met Roselle coming out from under my desk. And I took her leash and I said, heel, which meant to come around on my left side and sit, which she did. And about that time, the building dropped straight down about 6 feet. The reason it dropped was because tall buildings like that, as I said, are flexible. And what they're constructed with are expansion joints. They're made to flex. And when the building tipped, the expansion joints opened. And when the building became vertical again, then the expansion joints contracted and it went back to normal configuration. One of the things that I had done was to spend a good amount of time learning all I could about the complex, learning all I could about the buildings, consulting with the Port Authority people, the fire prevention people, the police, emergency preparedness, and so on, and wandering around the complex using a white cane, actually, not even the dog, for a while. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to learn where everything was, and the dog would go around things in the middle of floors like on the first floor was a shopping mall, and there were a lot of little kiosks in the middle of the shopping area. I wanted to know where they were and what they were. I wanted to know where other offices were. I wanted to know what the emergency evacuation procedures were, and so on. And the reality is that I could only learn that by asking and meeting with people, which I did. And the fact of the matter is that because I knew all of that, what I didn't realize at the time was that that created a mindset in me that if there ever were an emergency, we'd be okay. We could do all we could. If the building was going to collapse, there was nothing I could do about that. So um, um, basically, when the building did misbehave, if you will, the mindset clicked in and I knew what to do. So after the building got vertical and I met Roselle coming out and then the building dropped 6 feet, David, who was in the office with me, turned and looked out the window and started shouting, "Oh my God, Mike, there's fire and smoke above us. We got to get out of here right now." And I could hear things rushing by our window outside, just brushing against the building. But now that David told me there were millions of pieces of burning paper falling outside the window, I knew what the rushing was. But the fact is, what I told David was slow down, calm down. No, we got to get out of here. The building's on fire. I can see the fire above us. We got to get out of here. I said, slow down. Our guests began to scream and started moving toward our exit. But then they heard me tell David, slow down, stop. And they were waiting to see what was going to happen. And then finally, David used the big line, as I like to call it. He finally said, "You don't understand. You can't see it." See what I'm saying? Back to the usual attitude. The reality was, however, it wasn't what I wasn't seeing that was the issue. It was what David wasn't seeing. Namely, sitting next to me was a dog who was doing just fine, thank you very much. She was yawning and wagging her tail and going, "Who woke me up?" And I knew what Roselle was like when she was afraid because she was afraid of thunder, but she wasn't exhibiting any fear, which told me that whatever was going on wasn't such an imminent threat to us that we couldn't try to evacuate in an orderly way. And I finally
Mm,
got David to focus and said, "Get our guests to the stairs. Don't let them take the elevators because you're seeing fire. And if that fire is in the elevator shafts, because that's in the middle of the building, if the fire is in the elevator shafts and gets into cars, people will be killed." So
mhm,
David got our guests out of our office to the stairs. Meanwhile, I tried to call, and I did call Karen. As I said, I spoke with her at home. It was long before the media got the story. It was like 8:47. It was only 2 minutes after the building was hit, and um, we we talked, and I told her there was an explosion or something. We're going to have to leave, and she wanted to know more. I said I don't know anymore, which I didn't. But we hung up. David came back. We swept the office, make sure we didn't miss anything, leave anyone, and then we went to the stairs and we started down. And immediately I began smelling this odor. And it took me 4 floors to realize I was smelling what I smelled every time I went to the airport, that is, burning jet fuel, kerosene. When I observed that to other people around us, they said, "Yeah, we were trying to figure out what it is. You're right. It's burning jet fuel. We must have been hit by an airplane," but we didn't know for sure.
mm,
And all the way down the stairs, we kept smelling it. We kept smelling that odor. And we walked down the stairs. I kept encouraging Roselle, "Good dog, Roselle. What a good girl. You're doing a great job." And she focused. I praised her a lot because I wanted to convey to her the message, "I'm okay. I'm not afraid." Well, I wanted her to believe that. I mean, I certainly was as afraid as anyone else. But what I realized a long time later was that my mindset had taught me how to use fear as a powerful tool, rather than letting it overwhelm me and blind me or paralyze me or just overwhelm me to the point that I couldn't function because I was too afraid. Because the reality is, my mindset told me, you know what to do, just do everything that you can. And um, that actually, during the beginning of the pandemic, led to my latest book, which I wrote entitled Live Like a Guide Dog: True Stories from a Blind Man and His Dogs About Being Brave, Overcoming Adversity, and Moving Forward in Faith. And that book was published in August of 2024. But the reality is, you can learn to control fear. I will not tell people don't be afraid. That's not practical. But I can, and I do tell people, you can learn to focus fear and use it as a powerful tool. And that's what I did going down the stairs. So we walked down the stairs. We met firefighters coming up at one point. Um, and there were a couple times that people panicked on the stairs, and we had to deal with that when that happened. We had literally a group hug and told people, "You're okay. You can keep doing it." I and other people who were focused did that, and we kept people focused and kept them going down the stairs. Um, David panicked at about the 50th floor. He just said, "Mike, we're going to die. We're not going to make it out of here." And by the way, our guests who had already started down the stairs um, ended up on the second floor and saw us evacuate, and they all got out. But um, but David panicked and said, "Mike, we're going to die. We're not going to make it out of here." And I love to humorously say I used all those skills I learned as a teacher, especially in that secret class, Voice 101, how to yell at students, right? And I said to David, "Stop it, David. If Roselle and I can go down these stairs, so can you." And that brought him out of the funk that he was descending
Mhm.
into. And what he then did was something that I love to talk about because I think it's important. David said, "I'm going to walk a floor below you and I'm going to shout up to you what I see on the stairs because I got to take my mind off of all of this." And I said, "Okay." So he would go down and I was on the 49th floor and he said, "Hey, I'm on the 48th floor. All is good here." And we ended up walking at about the same speed. So he stayed a floor ahead of us. Eventually, he got to the 44th floor, and I was on floor 45. And he said, "Hey, this is the 44th floor. This is where the Port Authority cafeteria is, not stopping, going down the stairs." The reason I mention it and the reason I talk about it is that in reality, I think David did more than anyone to keep panic away from so many people because he was shouting up to me. But in reality, he was being heard by hundreds or maybe thousands of people as we went down the stairwell,
Mhm.
and he gave them something to focus on, someone who was okay somewhere on the stairs, above them or below them. And he was saying, "I'm okay," essentially. 43rd floor, all is good here. So, even though it isn't really talked about a lot, David kept so many people focused going down the stairs. And so I think that's an important thing for people to know because we all learned to work together as a team and keep us all focused and went down the stairs and finally made it out. And there were times that Roselle wasn't able to guide because it was so crowded, especially with the firefighters, that I just held on to a handrail and she actually walked behind me because there wasn't room for us to walk side by side. And she was fine with that. She was still getting all that praise because I wanted her to know all was okay. We finally got
Mhm.
outside, and when we got to the first floor, we were told we needed to leave, but they were telling people don't go outside through the doors right here in Tower One. Go into the central area and go through the central area. We didn't know until much later that what was going on is that if we had gone out those doors, it would have been right below where people were jumping and below where the planes hit. So, or the plane hit. So, anyway, we finally were outside. We walked over to Broadway and then started walking north on Broadway on the west side or left side of the street. And um, so we we kept walking and finally got to Vesey Street. And David said, I can see Tower Two because we were really close to it. And he said, "I can see the fire. I want to take some pictures of what I'm seeing." And so he took his camera out, was taking pictures. I took my phone out. I tried to call Karen. I couldn't get through. I had just put my phone away and David was putting his camera away when a police officer yelled, "Get out of here! It's coming down now!" And we heard this rumble that became this deafening roar. I describe it as kind of a combination of a freight train and a waterfall. You could hear glass breaking and metal clattering. Tower 2, which was like 100 yards away from us, was collapsing. Everyone turned and ran, and David turned and ran. He was gone. I turned Roselle 180 degrees and started running back the way we came. And I remember that the first thing that I thought of as I was starting to run was, God, I can't believe that you got us out of a building just to have it collapse on us. And as soon as I thought that, I heard in my head as clearly as you're hearing me now. And I talk about this, by the way, in my first book, Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at ground zero, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller for 1 week. But anyway, what I talk about in Thunderdog and what I'm describing now is that when I thought, God, I can't believe that you got us out of a building for it, just to have it fall on us, immediately I heard in my head a voice that said, don't worry about what you can't control. Focus on running with Roselle, and the rest will take care of itself. And I had this absolute sense of calm and conviction that if we worked together, we would be fine. So we ran, we got to Fulton Street, which was the street that we had just crossed a little while before, turned right on Fulton, and we actually caught up to David. And when then we started running together, we were engulfed in the dust cloud, all the dirt and debris from Tower 2 as it was collapsing. And we knew we had to get out of that dust cloud because it would have suffocated us. And I started telling Roselle, right, right. I don't know whether she could hear me or even see my hand signals because I was doing hand signals. But suddenly I heard an opening on the right, and she must have known what I wanted because she turned right. She took one step, she stopped, and she wouldn't move. Come on, Roselle, keep going. She wouldn't move. And I realized she had to stop for a reason. Focus on running with Roselle, the rest will take care of itself. So when I examined, I checked, I stuck a foot out and discovered, and I also stuck a hand along the wall and discovered we were at the top of a flight of stairs. Roselle did exactly what she was supposed to do. She got to the top of a flight of stairs and she stopped so we wouldn't fall down the stairs. She was waiting for the appropriate command. So after she got some praise and a hug, I said, Roselle, forward. And we went down the stairs and went into the Fulton Street subway station. We were in a little arcade area after going down a couple of flights, and there were some other people there. And we were there for a few minutes when a gentleman came up from further down in the subway system. He introduced himself as Lou, an employee of the subway system, and he took us down to an employee locker room where there was a water fountain and there were benches and a fan and so on. We just kind of all hacked and coughed. There were about 8 or 9 of us at the time in the little arcade area. When we got to where Lou took us, there were a few other people there already as well. But anyway, we stayed there a few minutes. Then a police officer came and said, you need to leave right now. The air is clearer up above. You can't stay here. So we followed him back up the stairs, through the arcade, up the last 2 flights of stairs, got outside. David looked around and he said, oh my God, Mike, there's no Tower 2 anymore. And I said, what do you see? And he said, all I see are pillars of smoke, hundreds of feet tall. That's all I see. I said, you sure? And he said, yeah, it's gone. So we stood there a moment and then we just continued to walk away, going um, on Fulton Street and going west on Fulton. And we did that for a few minutes. And then suddenly we heard that freight train waterfall sound again. And we realized it was probably Tower 1, our tower, collapsing. David looked back and he saw that there was a dust cloud coming at us. We were in a little plaza area. There was a retaining wall. We got behind it and ducked down. And after everything passed us by and it got quiet, we got up. David looked around and he said, oh my God, Mike, there's no World Trade Center anymore. And I said, what do you see? And he said, all I see are fingers of fire and flame, hundreds of feet tall, pillars of smoke. The complex, it's gone. And to think that 3 hours before we had gone in just to do our jobs and mind our own business, because some thugs decided that they didn't like a lot of people, they conducted an operation that almost, well, sort of did bring us all to our knees. And they damaged and destroyed the World Trade Center, attacked the Pentagon, which we learned later, and so on. After the building collapsed and we got up and saw that it had collapsed, I tried to call Karen, and this time I got through, and she's the one who told us what had happened, that the towers had collapsed. Well, that the towers had been hit by hijacked aircraft. Um, uh, an aircraft had been crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth was still missing over Pennsylvania. And um, we figured out what had occurred, and just who would have ever thought that anyone would do that? But they did. And so the rest of the day we spent working toward getting up to Midtown Manhattan, and I discovered the trains were running, and so I wanted to go back out to Westfield where we lived, and I was able to stay in touch with Karen. David was staying with his sister on the Upper East Side of New York, so we went to the train station. Um, we said goodbye there, and then he walked on up to where his sister was, and I got on trains and went to Newark and then back out to Westfield. And my wife met me there. A friend of ours who Karen had known since high school, who also coincidentally lived in New Jersey now, Tom Painter, had actually gone down to our house, not knowing when he first decided to come down whether I was working from home that day or in the World Trade Center or what. And of course, he got there and heard from Karen what was going on. He ended up staying with us for a week, but he drove Karen in our van, our wheelchair accessible van. Normally, Karen would drive, but she didn't want to, and he said, "I'll drive." He went. They went to the train station. They picked me up, and we went home. As soon as we got home, I took off Roselle's harness. I was going to take her out, and she would have none of it. She just ran away, grabbed her favorite tugboat, and started playing tug of war with my retired guide dog, Linny. Why? Because dogs don't do what if, which is something we talk about in Live Like a Guide Dog. It was
Mm-hmm.
over for her. It was done. We were home. She was fine. Nothing directly threatened her. And it's a lesson we all should learn. We try to what if everything. We try to what if everything over which we have no control. That's one of the things that causes us to become fearful. And
Mm-hmm.
Roselle taught a good lesson. Don't what if everything. Worry about what you can control. Don't worry about the stuff you can't, and the rest will take care of itself. Because if you worry about everything, all you're going to do is drive yourself crazy. But that's what happened. And so that's kind of the day.
Wow. I I'm speechless. Like, it's such an moving story. Uh, Interesting enough, I even got sweaty hands, although I obviously knew how it ended for you. I was like, oh my God. And how you described that you went, from floor to floor, and how the teamwork was, and how every person was essential for you all to get out safe.
Hmm.
And also imagining how your wife must have felt when you called her the first time and she doesn't hear from you, she doesn't hear from you. And then waiting for the call, in the meantime, seeing on the media what happens, not knowing whether you're okay or not. So I was just also imagining, wow, your wife she must have been terrified.
Well, she was worried, but she also had her own mindset, and her personality makeup was either he's going to come back alive or he's not. So she said, I'm sure that some people are going to start coming over. So she cleaned up the house a little bit and all that, and just focused on doing stuff to keep busy
Mm-hmm.
until she found one way or another. But sure, I mean, she was certainly very worried and very concerned.
Mm.
But again, she knew that she couldn't be so terrified that she couldn't function. But when I was able to call her, needless to say, there were tears on both sides of the phone, if you will, when I
Yeah.
called.
Michael, I do want to make sure people read your book, the one you mentioned, Live Like a Guide Dog,
And Thunderdog.
and Thunderdog, but particularly Live Like a Guide Dog, because that's the one that I read. And I was really blown by a lot of things that you mentioned. So first of all, I loved the structure because each chapter was dedicated to one of your guide dogs, and each chapter had a huge life lesson.
Hmm.
And you already mentioned that, where I was like, really, I was like, wow, that doctor really said that, because you mentioned
Hmm.
earlier that, no blind child could ever, and I'm going to like read that, no blind child could ever grow up to be able to contribute to society.
Hmm.
All this child will be is a drain on your family. And I was like, how is it possible that someone is saying this? This is like so awful. And I love what you, because you talked a lot about the parenting style of your parents. And I also heard in an interview that you were riding a bicycle like everyone else. And that even one of your neighbors called because he was like telling your dad, I need to talk to you about your blind child. He was riding a bicycle. He just couldn't cope with the fact that you were able to do that. And you are such a testimony to being able to do things differently. And I think that's something that we can all learn. It's not about doing things in one way, but finding a way that we can do it however it, however it's able, however it's possible for us. And I love your parents did such a great job encouraging you. And I think everything you have shared, particularly in the beginning of the episode, shows your parents really, really made sure and ingrained that you are able to do anything that you put your mind to, like anything, whatever it is. And I really, really, really love that. And can you, you also said in that one particular chapter, which is called Awareness Builds Confidence. When you talked about your childhood, you said, I didn't realize at the time, but building the skill of awareness also deconstructed and diminished my fear. Can you elaborate how developing the skill of awareness has helped you on your journey, and also how it could help our audience with their own fears?
One of my favorite speeches, in fact, I'm going to be delivering it in Boston in a couple of weeks, is called Thinking Outside the Box is Not Always the Best Approach. And it's all about developing the tools and using the tools of your inner toolbox, which can help you think outside the box better. But we don't spend nearly enough time analyzing what we do during the day. We fear so many things. Things happen and we regard it as a failure and so on. I used to say all the time, I'm my own worst critic because I love to listen to my speeches when I can record them because I want to hear what I say and I want to hear it from the perspective of people who are listening to it because I want to do all I can to improve it. And I used to say I'm my own worst critic. And I realized actually in 2023, not the right thing to say at all. I'm not my own worst critic. The only one who can truly teach me, a lot of people can provide me with information and so on, but the only one who can truly teach me using all that information is me. I'm not my own worst critic. I'm my own best teacher, which turns that
Mm-hmm.
whole concept around and makes it positive. And the reality is that we spend so much time worrying about, well, this didn't work. I must have failed at that. No, not necessarily. Maybe there was something that you could have done differently that would have made it better. Even when something is successful, could you have done it better? We really need to take the time every day, at the end of the day, for example, or maybe when we wake up in the morning, but at the end of the day, especially, what happened today? What worked? What didn't work? Why was I afraid of what didn't work? What can I do to make it better? The
Mm-hmm.
reality is, if we exercise our mind muscle and we work to improve how we approach things, because ultimately we have to make the decision to do that and become more aware, we'll learn not to be so afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the things that are afraid of all the time are things that are never going to happen because, as again I said earlier, we worry about all the things that we can't control and we fear them all. Um, and the reality is that's not going to help. And so we need to focus on the things that we have control over, and the rest, there's nothing we can do about them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had other experiences in my life where I've had to deal with life that way. The fact of the matter is, you don't have control over something. Fearing it, letting it overwhelm you isn't a good thing. And so when you develop and understand that and know it, and you listen to your inner voice, um, you will become a lot less fearful and a lot more aware of everything going on around you.
Oh, I totally agree. Like I call it, the self. Everything is connected. You know, when you build self awareness, you build self confidence, self belief, self worth, and so on. So it definitely starts with knowing yourself, and the better you know yourself, particularly also your reactions in certain stress situations or fear or when you're scared, that more freedom you will experience in life, and the more you can choose in a stressful situation to choose courage over fear. And I wonder, because your book talks a lot about fear, what do you believe is the purpose of fear beyond survival instincts?
I believe fear is a powerful tool that lets us know something is different than it usually is. And we
Mm-hmm.
have to learn how to deal with that and recognize and discover what's different and then decide, is it something we can deal with or not.
And
The fact of the matter is, a lot of times the fear isn't well founded, and it's our own brain making up something because we haven't taught ourselves to not let fear overwhelm us, but rather we should be teaching ourselves to face or recognize fear and say, all right, what is it I'm really afraid of here? And
mm,
and then analyze it and go, I really shouldn't be afraid of that. That's nothing that I have anything to do with.
how can we build a healthier relationship with fear and also see it more as our friend than our enemy? Like, is there a practical, small day to day practice that you could share with us?
Sure. Introspection at the end of the day. Take some time and think about your day. What happened today? Um, how did I react to different things? Why did I react the way I did to
Mm-hmm.
different things? Was it right? Did it really help for me to react that way? The more you do that, the more self discovery you will find taking place in your own life, and the more self discovery that you have, the more that you will learn what you should truly do with different situations. And you'll discover things like there's no real such thing as failure. If something really didn't work right, why didn't it work? It may very
Mm-hmm.
well be a misconception, or it may very well be that I didn't listen to something or someone who said, do it this way, and that was a better way. But when you discover things that don't work, take the time to also go, okay, I messed up on that somehow. What can I do differently next time? You've got to focus on how to deal with different kinds of things that happen to you. And when you do that, and you take the time to volitionally do that, you will discover how you can allow fear to be something on which to focus. Let me give you another example. This is a personal one. Um, Over the past few months, there have been a few times that when I've been walking that I started to feel a little bit weak. And also, I would have some pain, especially in my left arm. And I mentioned I was going in for some blood draws routine and to get a couple of vaccinations a couple of weeks ago. But I mentioned it to my doctor, and he said, well, all right, we'll put a couple of other tests in. And one of them was for a heart enzyme called troponin. And what that is an enzyme usually from heart attacks or something where the heart is stressed. Um, because normally your troponin level is in the 0 to 20, and I was in still at the clinic after having had the blood draws, and I get a phone call. You've got to be back here right now, and I said I haven't left yet. Well, stay there, and they whisked me away to the emergency room at the nearest hospital because my troponin level was at 1190,
Oh my
and
God.
so they had to figure out what was going on. Well, years ago, I had an echocardiogram, and the doctor said, "You got a valve that leaks just a little bit. Nothing urgent, nothing to do with it right now, but sometime in the future you may have to." Well, I guess that time has come because what they discovered
Mm,
after doing an angiogram and an echocardiogram now was that this valve was not doing well. And when when I was first contacted about it, immediately for me, it wasn't a fear issue. I had forgotten all about the original echocardiogram years ago, but the first thing that I thought of is, okay, let's go figure out what's going on. They took me by ambulance to the hospital. I was in the emergency room, literally overnight because they didn't find any beds to release. And so, but they did the angiogram and so on, and the doctor said, you've got a bad heart valve. I know that I never experienced fear as such. Why me? Terror or anything like that. My approach the whole time was, okay, something is going on. Let's figure it out and figure out what the process is to deal with it. And so they discovered that there is a bad valve. They talk about replacing it, which will be done. And I'm actually going in for a consult next week. But the reality is that, again, I knew that fear is only going to make it worse. If I let fear overwhelm me and my heart just starts racing and so on. And again, it was a mindset that kicked in just like on
Mhm.
September 11th, the same thing. The reality is we can learn to deal with things and we can learn to deal with the unexpected. And most of all, we can learn how to focus to deal appropriately with the unexpected.
Mm. For the preparation for our conversation, I was listening to multiple of your interviews, and in one of your interviews, the interviewer asked you, very surprised, how it was possible for you to be so confident and optimistic and positive, and your answer was one word, and it was training. And I
Yeah.
really, really love that answer. And the reason why I want to share it, because a lot of people have this misconception that confidence or optimism, courage is, comes from crazy or extreme things like skydiving or public speaking in front of thousands of people, or having like a major life shift. But the truth is, it is a muscle that we have to train or get to train on a daily basis with small things where we step outside our comfort zone in moments where we can choose. Do we choose fear or do we choose confidence, solution focus, focusing on what we can control? So I'm so glad you brought that up. And I also, on this point, want to mention for people that are very interested how they can build a powerful mindset, a mindset that is fighting for them rather than against them, should definitely check out your podcast, which is called The Unstoppable Mindset. And you said something really great in episode 286, and it says, we need to recognize fear does not need to blind or overwhelm us. We can deal with it like anything in our lives if we choose to. And you also mentioned in another interview, there are a lot of things that happen to us that we don't necessarily have any control over. But what we absolutely and totally have control over is how we deal with it and
Hmm.
how we react to it. So it's definitely, it comes down to a lot of choices. And I also want people to keep in mind when they hear you talking now, you have had many years, you had decades of practice, but I also want to say it is never too late to change one's mindset. Um, and yeah, so it's never too late. It's, because I know people like you were very fortunate that your parents taught you already a lot about the mindset, and also that you found a wife that had a similar empowering mindset. But I do think, even for people that weren't that fortunate, any day we can choose to cultivate a new mindset. We can choose to sow new seeds and plant new trees, which actually do serve us in our lives.
Yeah. Sometimes people think when you say that you're able to deal with fear, it's ego. Well, it's not ego. It has nothing to do with that. It is training. It is learning
Mm-hmm.
how to develop that mindset. And no matter what happened on September 11th, if I need any additional proof of that, it's what happened around this whole issue with the heart valve and
Mm-hmm.
and other times in my life. But the reality is that we have the ability to choose whether or not we're going to develop that mind muscle. And every single one of us can, but we have to make the choice. No one can choose that for us. We
Mm-hmm.
have to make that choice. And if we do, and we decide to move forward with learning how to develop that mind muscle, it doesn't happen overnight, but it is something that we can do. And I think everyone should learn to do it.
Michael, I have two questions for you regarding fear. And one is coming from our audience. So we're picking each episode a question from our audience. Hannah is asking, how do I know if the feeling of fear is protecting me from danger or keeping me from taking the risk that will actually get me where I want to be?
And the answer is you don't until you learn how to deal with fear.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that um, when when you are confronted by a fearful situation, if you've developed this muscle and you've learned to control fear and use it to help you focus, you will also learn how to deal with deciding whether I'm in danger or something else. Those are all
Mm-hmm.
things that you can deal with very quickly. We we knew something happened in the World Trade Center. We didn't know what, and at first, we didn't know how dangerous it was. But then when we got into the stairwell and started smelling the fumes from burning jet fuel, we figured out an airplane hit the building. So we knew something was going on. But again, we didn't know what.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, when we got all the way down to the bottom and we had gotten out of the stairwell, a gentleman from the FBI came up and he said, I'll get you guys where you need to go. And I asked him what was going on. And he said, no time to tell you. And I'm sure that they did that, and they did that with a lot of people because they didn't want to suddenly cause terror.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, I would rather have known because knowing gives me the ability to make more intelligent decisions about where to go and what to do. But he didn't know me, so I appreciate that they did the best that they could do. But the reality is that um, you have to learn how to develop the ability to focus fear, and it becomes a different thing when you learn to focus it because it becomes something that will tell you whether you're in danger or whether there's something else going on. Because what's
Mm-hmm.
really going on for most people with fear is that they just let it overwhelm them so they can't make any decision and they don't know, they're not able to observe. And the
Mm.
whole point is you've got to get to the point where you can do that again.
Thank you so much for sharing this. What I would also add when we talk about danger, because obviously, particularly in the conversation with you, people would think about when their life is in danger. But I think oftentimes when fear comes up, it's also like the danger of loss, it's the danger of being heartbroken, it's the danger of being rejected, not liked, failing, or like there's so many fears that come up. And I personally call it what's the difference between intuition and fear.
Hmm.
And I always think intuition is something that I feel in my gut. And it's a very calming, comforting feeling. And fear is something that, like makes me feel uncomfortable. And usually when it's then the fear, I'm asking myself because I see fear, unless obviously it's a survival instinct, fear for me is showing me where there are wounds that still need healing.
Well, there's truth to that, but fear and
Mm,
intuition um, also can combine, and I think again it's all in the training.
mhm.
Um, so it's a matter of really practicing and developing the skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, what I would also suggest adding to your bad night routine of reflecting on the day is also what were moments. like adding as a journal prompt maybe, what were moments where you were able to deal with your fear?
Sure.
Or, what were moments where you actually had a strong mindset, where you chose thoughts that were, comforting you, lifting you up rather than actually draining you. So, and I think it's great to celebrate those little wins because, like it can be something in the morning when the alarm clock goes off rather than thinking, "Oh my god, again it's Monday," or "Oh my god, again I need to get up." It can be immediately switching that thought to like, "I'm grateful to be alive, that I get to experience another day." And that's already a win as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
But again, it's all part of the same thing, and it's
Yeah,
really
it's
a
all the
matter of how
mindset
you.
and
Yeah,
training.
exactly
Hmm.
right.
Yeah. Michael, I ask every guest that I get to interview in 2025 one question, and I'm really curious what you are answering. So the question is, if your heart had the wings to rise above fear, what would you do?
Um, I would well, I would hope that in a sense, it's not rising above fear; it's embracing it. And
Mm-hmm.
the reality is that I want my heart to understand what fear is, what it isn't, and most of all, I want it to know me so that it can help me make the decisions that I need to make on a day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute basis in order to live the best life that I can. And so it isn't so much rising above fear. Again, you're changing how you deal with fear. And again, fear has a psychological component and has a physiological component. And
Mm-hmm.
some of that you may not necessarily be totally able to deal with. You're going to react physically to different things. But mentally, you can learn to control so many aspects of your life. And I want my heart to help me make sure that whether it's something fearful or something else that's going on in my life, that I am doing the best that I can to deal with it, whatever it is. And I
Mm-hmm.
believe that that will happen. And that's also part of it is having the
Mm-hmm.
conviction that it will happen. It doesn't happen all at once. It will happen
Mm-hmm.
more and more as you focus on um, introspection, as I said, and thinking about
Mm.
what's going on. But you have to develop that skill. And
Thank you so
I want to
much.
also say this isn't the lack of
Mm-hmm.
emotion. This isn't acting like a Vulcan, from
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek. It is it is all about learning how
Mm-hmm.
to focus yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love, first of all, I will definitely change the question to if your heart had the wings to embrace your fears. I love that. Thank you so much. And one thing that also came to my mind is thinking when I was at high school, I was a competitive golf player, and from one day to the other, like I started to develop like a real panic before competition,
Mm.
so much so that it would like physically impact me.
Yeah.
And last year, I had a podcast interview, and I remember calling my dad afterwards and I said, "You know what, Dad? I felt today the exact same thing I felt 17 years ago before a big championship. But the big difference is back then I thought it was fear. I called it fear. And now I call it excitement."
Hmm. And again, it's how you deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. It's the mindset and choosing thoughts that work for me rather than against me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's it. It's working for you and not against you, and that you have control over.
Mm. Michael, before we close with our pet Q&A, I want to make sure there's one more question I really want to ask you. So you dedicated your latest book to your late wife, Karen. And I'm interested how, because teamwork is very close to your heart, and so is Karen. So, because how did you apply teamwork to your relationship? And the reason why I'm very curious, because a lot of people associate teamwork with professional settings, But I do think it is very, very important to apply this to any kind of relationship. And one of the best things I've heard about a relationship or having a discussion is that it's not a matter of if you are right or if I'm right, but it's about coming to the point that we are a team and that we come together to a solution.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly it. That I learned more about trust and teamwork from working with 8 guide dogs than I ever learned from all the experts in the field,
Mm-hmm.
because it was putting it all into practice and learning how to communicate with these creatures that communicate differently than we was important, but also getting a little bit more insight on how they think as much as we can have that insight, and using that to develop the better way of communicating, and recognizing that whether it's a guide dog or a pet or whatever, it's all about developing a teaming relationship. And in
Mm-hmm.
marriage, it's all about developing a teaming relationship. You're right. It isn't about being right. It's about coming together. And every marriage has its challenges, but what works best is communicating and coming to a solution that everyone can agree to and work on together. And the togetherness is the most important thing, and it's what we usually miss. But that's what, fortunately, I learned how to do with dogs, and
Mm.
and other things. I've written 3 books: Thunderdog, a book called Running with Roselle, which was more for children, and Live Like a Guide Dog. Every book was written collaboratively. We had another author helping, and I feed off of that. I love it to have
Mm-hmm.
people to work with, and each book was with a different person, but the books are all more powerful because of the fact that we worked together. We brought a couple of different points of view, or there were times that we had to have some good long discussions about why we needed to do it certain ways and so on. But it's all about collaboration, and
Mm.
the more of that we do, the better our lives will be. Gandhi once said, interdependence is and ought to be as much the ideal of man as his self sufficiency.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good one. And it's I totally agree, like collaboration adds so much to our lives. And I must say for me it's very interesting looking back coming from an individual sport. I've always been a very social person and I love spending time with people. Also, I have 2 younger brothers, but I do know that over the years, I definitely had to learn to trust in teamwork.
Hmm.
Because I was the kind of person, whether it was at school or at university, when we had like a group homework or essay or some presentation, I was usually the one doing almost all the work, but not because others were like lazy, but because I didn't really trust that they would do their work.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to discover whether they really will or not. But you can't
Oh,
just
yeah.
make those
With
decisions.
some,
But
I
you
was
can't.
right.
Yeah, and sometimes you will be right, and sometimes you won't be right.
Yeah. So I think it's, and I even like this podcast shows, we grew so fast, particularly because it is a collaboration. Whether it's my entire team, every single guest that comes on the show, every person that listens to the podcast, every person that shares the podcast. So everything together is definitely better.
Yep.
And I also, you said you had 8 guide dogs, and I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to pronounce the name correctly, but one of them was called Fantasia.
Fantasia. Well, actually, that
Fantasia.
Fantasia wasn't a guide dog. She was my wife's service dog. She was the mother.
Oh.
She was the mother of my 7th guide dog, Africa. Um, and,
Mm.
and but she came to live with us because she was a breeder at Guide Dogs for the Blind,
Mm-hmm.
and um, the breeder dogs, when they're not doing their puppy thing, go live in people's homes because it's a whole lot better than living in kennels. But
Mm-hmm.
Fantasia figured out on her own that Karen, being in a wheelchair, needed help, like when she would drop something. Fantasia figured out to pick things up and give them to Karen. She she taught herself to be a service dog.
Wow. Well, I found a post where you said we lost Fantasia, who may well have been the most exceptional dog friend, teacher, and magnificent hero of them all.
Hmm?
So that's why I thought we're going to dedicate our closing pet Q&A to her. My first question is, if you could ask her one question, what would it be?
um, if I could ask her one question, I'd probably ask her, "What does she think of us?" I guess I would probably ask her how she figured out how to be a service dog. Let me tell you another
Mm.
story about Fantasia. We have a dog toy called a go nut, which is looks like a donut. It's very hard rubber, but it looks like a donut, so it's got a hole in the middle and so on. And one day, Karen let Fantasia be up on the bed. I won't let my guide dogs do that, but because we travel to various places and I don't want them to be in that habit. But Fantasia was with Karen. So Fantasia was on the bed trying to chew on a bone, a nyla bone, and it kept slipping away. And so suddenly she dropped the bone on the bed, jumped down, went into the other room, came back with a go nut, got back up on the bed, put the bone in the hole in the middle of the go nut so it wouldn't slide around and started chewing on it.
Oh my God, so smart.
So I would, yeah, so I would, I'd ask Fantasia, how did you figure out how to be
Mm,
a service dog, and what do you think of the whole process?
wow, that is amazing. And what is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, I guess, you are grateful for her?
Because she supported both of us, especially Karen, so well.
Mm.
She um, was just a great friend to both of us, and really liked to be around us and supported us. And when she wanted to go to bed, she would let us know, and she bugged us until we went into the bedroom and got on the bed with her.
And what did she teach you about love?
That love is unconditional, and also at the same time, trust is not. But I learned that from all of my dogs, including Fantasia, that in reality, um, the difference between dogs and people is that dogs tend to be more open to trust unless something just horrible has happened to them that turns that feeling off. Dogs are more open to trust, and it's again a lesson that we could learn. But they don't trust unconditionally like they love unconditionally. But the more you develop that trust and the more you work at it, the better the relationship is.
Michael, thank you so, so much. I very much so enjoyed our conversation. I was moved, inspired, empowered, and I am pretty sure that our audience will feel exactly the same.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here. And as I've said, I am a speaker. If anybody is looking to hire a speaker, I would love to talk with you.
Mhm.
People can reach out to me. It's real easy. You can email speaker at Michael Hingson. That's MICHAELHINGSON.com. Speaker at michaelhingson.com. Love you to go visit our website, www.michaelhingson.com. And um, so we'd love to hear from people who want a speaker or who just want to email with questions.
Mm.
And I hope that they will buy our books. Thunderdog and Live Like a Guide Dog were published by mainstream publishers and are available both still anywhere books are sold. Running with Roselle was self-published and is available through Amazon and distribution that deals with getting Amazon books. So all the books are available. I hope people will read them. As I love to
Mhm.
tell people, when people buy our books, they're helping to keep my current guide dog Alamo in kibbles. So we appreciate it.
We'll definitely put all the links in our show notes to make sure people can follow up. And yes, I can definitely recommend, particularly reading Live Like a Guide Dog. And also, please make sure you listen to Michael's podcast.
Unstoppable mindset. We
Yes.
appreciate that. And if you want to be a guest, let us know. We're always looking for people who want to come on and tell their stories.
Michael, thank you so much. And I hope we'll have you back on the show one day.
Would love to. Thank you.
It's a wrap for today, everyone. If you loved this episode as much as we did, please share it with your friends, with your family, and anyone that needs some comfort when it comes to their fears. And we see you next Wednesday.